Good evening and welcome to the Portsmouth School Board meeting for August 23rd, 2011. If I could ask the superintendent to please take the roll call.
Ann Mayer.
Here.
Carol Chelman.
Here.
Rebecca Remison.
Here.
Kent LePage.
Here.
Dexter Legg.
Here.
Ann Walker.
Here.
Mitch Schulman.
Here.
Tom Martin.
Here.
Leslie Stevens.
Here.
Clay Haywood.
Here.
Linda Brulette.
Here.
Liz Boynton.
Here.
We have a full house. If I could ask you all to join me for a moment of silence, and then we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So I'll entertain a motion to accept the minutes from July 19th, which should be on your desk.
So moved. Second.
Any conversations, discussions, changes? All in favor of accepting?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. So we'll just, moving on to the public commentary period. We have one person who signed up, so I'd like to invite the assistant mayor to come to the microphone. Your name and address, please, although we all know who you are.
I'm Nancy Noveline Clayburgh, 405 FW Hartford Drive, Portsmouth. I wrote a letter to the editor with my cohort, Katie Leith, who is a former New Franklin parent. I'm a former Dondero parent, and we were both several founders of PEP 2000 in 1997. To the editor, in 1996, the climate among the 3 elementary schools in Portsmouth was contentious and bitter. The Portsmouth School Administration decided to have the city's 3 elementary schools compete with one another for computers by writing grants to the Portsmouth school system. The atmosphere became even more tense and angry when Dondero received the majority of the computer grants. During that period of time, Dondero was perceived by many people in the city to be the school of choice, and many real estate agents were telling prospective buyers, and I was one of them, to purchase homes in the Dondero district. The school also had the largest enrollment with 550 students, Little Harbor with approximately 350, and New Franklin with approximately 200 were Title I schools. In addition, there were residual feelings of discord and suspicion among many parents stemming from the previous round of redistricting and the closing of several elementary schools in the 1980s. At one time, Portsmouth had 11 elementary schools. In 1997, parents in all 3 schools had had enough. They decided to put aside differences and preconceptions and work together in a collaborative effort on a project that would benefit all the students in the city. It was decided that each school desperately needed a new playground. After several organizational meetings, PEP 2000, Portsmouth Elementary Playgrounds by the year 2000, was founded. In September 1999, school opened with 3 brand new state-of-the-art playgrounds. $180,000 was raised by PEP, with the city of Portsmouth contributing $75,000. It was an exciting time for our elementary schools. The entire community was included, with various fundraisers which included businesses, individuals, students, and parents. Parents made new friendships. The elementary school community was healing, and a new respect for all 3 schools emerged. The healing effort came from people who decided that working together as parents of Portsmouth students and forming close associations with administrators and the school board was more productive than finger-pointing and anger. Within a few years, the climate had cleared, and the 3 schools were united and able to work together when the last round of redistricting occurred 5 years ago. PEP also continued with collaborative fundraising, offering after-school programs for the elementary students. What we see today is discouraging for us who work so hard to build community and goodwill among our schools. Today, the 3 elementary schools are very similar in their academic achievement, with minimal differences among the test scores. If any school is lacking in any way, parents should work to solve the problem. We believe in open and honest discussion among parents and administrators. That is what parents should be doing in an effort to improve the school rather than causing discord and ill feeling in the community. Children should go to their neighborhood school. That's why our system is set up that way. We believe that the families making requests for transfers should reconsider and instead work with the administration, teachers, students, and other parents to improve their schools. Pitting schools against one another only creates discord. It's not fair to our kids. It's also not fair to our taxpayers if additional funds are approved to accommodate these students at Little Harbor. If the schools were significantly unbalanced academically, perhaps there would be justification. That is not the case, however, and we take pride in knowing that we and many, many others years ago worked together to seal the gap that separated the schools. It's signed by myself and Kate Leith, who is a former New Franklin parent, and we were both one of many founders of PEP 2000. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Although no one else signed up, does anyone else like to speak? Okay, seeing none, we'll close public comment, and we'll move on to the agenda. Special presentation.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Tom Hengelsberg is here from Dorr and Whittier, and I'm sure you'll introduce others here this evening, Tom. Welcome. He's going to do a brief presentation on the feasibility study that was completed just a couple of months ago. Welcome.
Welcome, thank you.
I'd like to introduce Donald Walter, who's a principal at Dorr and Whittier. He just wanted to say a few things.
Thanks for giving me a few minutes to speak. I just wanted to introduce Tom and Michelle Rogers, who have done the lion's share of the work on this project. We were hired almost a year ago now to do a comprehensive needs assessment study on the 3 elementary schools. And essentially what that consisted of was investigative work on the sites and buildings. A team of ours created that consisted of site consultants, architects, engineers that went through the buildings and developed a number of findings. We also went through and analyzed the educational programs within the buildings with a focus on the needs of the Portsmouth elementary school kids and making sure we met the New Hampshire DOE regulations. Based upon all that work that was done, we developed some what we think are sensible options for which could be considered potential solutions to those buildings moving forward. And just to emphasize, this is a long-term view of these schools. So what we want to do tonight is give you a brief overview of what was a pretty comprehensive look at the schools. And Tom is going to lead us through that presentation, and any questions that you may have, we'll be sure to try and answer them. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right. We'll just get right to it. First of all, here's our agenda for this presentation, which really, as Don mentioned, is just going to scratch the surface of a lot of the work that we did. It was a fairly long, involved process over the earlier months of the year, as you'll see by the photos. As we said, we really looked and investigated the existing conditions at each of the schools, came up with conclusions of what we saw and wrote that up. We studied the educational programming of each of the schools, how they fit the DOE regulations, were sizes of spaces over or under or just about right with Department of Ed regulations. And then from there we kind of went into a design phase where we looked at options for what to do to each of the schools to help remedy the situations. And then we'll have a conclusion that wraps that up. So the agenda is kind of following our process as we go. So when we first came on board, the question really boiled down to where do we stand with the schools, with the facilities? What is the overall state of the facilities? Do we have deficiencies? Where are we over? Where are we under with the Department of Ed regulations? And then there's a list, as you can see here, of a number of concerns that were brought to our attention, which are they're not atypical concerns for school buildings of this age and vintage. things about ventilation, concerns about ventilation, the efficiency of the mechanical and lighting systems, the electrical systems in the building, and then, just basic building code issues that we were asked to take a look at. And then also look at the site and how the circulation happened around the buildings, how buses interacted with the pathways, normal pathways with the children, and we did a little bit of work on that. I wouldn't say too in-depth on that. We were really concentrating mostly on the buildings themselves. So I'm just going to really hit the high points of the study. We're not going to get into too much detail in this presentation. Obviously, there is a fairly voluminous study that stands behind all this information that can be consulted for kind of drilling down. So what we found in the building conditions was actually, I would characterize as fairly relieving. Generally, the buildings were in pretty good condition. They're very well maintained. The staff does a really good job of maintaining the buildings. They're clean. Repairs seem to be taken care of in a fairly timely fashion, that sort of thing. All three buildings are in the late 60s vintage, and architects and engineers were not thinking about thermal performance of buildings at that time, so a lot is left to be desired on the external shell of the buildings, the insulation. This picture right here actually shows Little Harbor School, and some work has been done on the roof of that building to bring up the R value, but in general the walls are still just kind of solid masonry walls with very little insulation. There are code issues that we've cataloged in the report in a general way. And then we kind of get into the interior issues. There are issues with the storage in the classrooms. Some of the buildings and some areas of the buildings have open classrooms, so we've got noise issues and distraction issues that have to be dealt with by both the faculty and the students, the kids. And then the technology infrastructure, although passable, it's working. Upgrades could be had there. The only building of the three that has a sprinkler system is New Franklin. The other two do not have any sprinkler system, which we consider to be a fairly serious safety issue. The buildings are fire-resistant construction, so that's not such a big problem, but sprinkler systems would be safer, obviously. And then interior finishes, the buildings are getting on in years and could use some attention on the insides. As far as the sites are concerned, again, generally fairly good overall condition in most cases. We found that the building entrances need a little bit more prominence and personality when you first arrive on site. It's kind of, if you're new to the school system, you might find it hard to find the front door in some cases. So that's something that if we were looking at the outsides of the buildings, we would want to address. Handicapped accessibility needs improvement. Although we didn't see any really huge problems with accessibility, there are always little things that can be done to greatly improve how people in wheelchairs or mobility impaired people can get into the building and move around. Site circulation, I think really in all three cases, needs a fairly good look in terms of how the buses arrive and leave the site, the crossing of the paths of the kids and the buses, and car traffic, we found is a bit of a problem in some cases, which, again, not atypical for many schools. There are issues that have to be worked out. One of the other things that is a kind of, call it more of an out there thing, is a desire, I guess you'd say, is more outdoor learning spaces, trying to get the kids outdoors to learn a little bit more and get them interacting with nature, and having some kind of an outdoor space that sponsors that kind of an activity, like an outdoor classroom or an amphitheater or some type of space like that. So you would see that in our design options. Little Harbor parking lot needs to be repaved, just plain and simple. It's definitely on its last legs. And then New Franklin, this is a picture of the wonderful playground at New Franklin School. The building, however, is really surrounded by asphalt, and just some kind of breathing room from the asphalt to the building is something that would be desirable. So just some other overviews of our findings, some things that you would find in the report. Overall, we looked at the enrollments. That was one of the first things we actually did, was look at the enrollment history of the schools. And, these are all public documents, so it's no secret. There's a slight, steady downward trend, but if you look at the line, it's fairly flat, just a very slight downward trend. So enrollments, we would say, are fairly steady. As we are all aware, the enrollments between the three schools are fairly unequal. Little Harbor and New Franklin are trending up slightly, and Dondero is trending down. The classrooms in general, making a general statement, are mostly under the state standard of 900 square feet. Some of them are within 10% of that, and we'll show you some drawings that kind of give you that view graphically. And then there are a few that are significantly under that state standard. So core educational and support spaces, so things like art and music and those types of spaces, and support spaces like the cafeteria and gymnasium, those are typically undersized, under what you would like to see for an elementary school of this population. Administrative spaces are almost, the rule is they're almost always undersized, and often the layout is very non-functional, just inefficient use of space. So the classrooms in general, as I say, most rooms are fairly tight. Just to make a general statement, there's a lot of stuff in those rooms, and there's not a lot of storage space, and there's not a lot of permanent storage space. So teachers have had to improvise by bringing in fixtures. I mean, you can see here, I don't know which classroom this is or which school this is even, but you can see teachers have to improvise to put away all of their materials. There's very little natural light and views. That's something, it's somewhat difficult to address, but if we were to look at the outsides of the buildings, it might be nice to cut some more windows into some of these rooms, some of these classrooms, and get natural light and view into them more if we could. Just take it as a kind of a blanket statement for all three schools. The mechanical systems are, for the most part, outdated, inefficient. Electrical systems are, I think, in all three schools, except for the newest edition of New Franklin, are pretty overtaxed in terms of the amount of capacity that's left on the panels and so forth. So there's not much room for expansion if one were to expand there. So new electrical service would probably be needed if one were to go ahead with major renovations. As I say, some of the classrooms are open, so you have the noise and the distractions. These are, depending on who you talk to, these are generally looked at as somewhat negative things, but some of the teachers actually do like the openness, and they feel that it forms how can I say it? It sort of forces the kids to be a little bit more on their best behavior, because they know that they're going to be disturbing other classes if they're noisy. So, yeah, you can look at it that way. Lighting in all three schools is pretty difficult. It's either overlit or it's underlit, and most of the fixtures are fairly outdated and inefficient. So I know some of the schools have been gone through, some rooms in the schools have been gone through more recently, and some lighting updated, but the fixtures in general are fairly inefficient. So, and then again, technology infrastructure. I'd say on the whole, the schools are doing pretty well with technology. You seem to be acquiring, smart boards, and there's some of that going on in some of the classrooms. So, that is all. Those are all very positive things. Special ed is, I guess, I would have to say, is a difficult spot in some of the schools. A lot of the special ed spaces have been carved out of storage rooms and secondary spaces within the middle of the building. So there's not windows with view and natural light and ventilation in some of the spaces. So that's, I would say, just looking at the buildings in terms of the program, probably one of the more difficult spots that would need some attention going forward. Yeah, and then the other thing that we noticed is the special education functions tend to be concentrated in one area rather than being more dispersed throughout the buildings and more directly related to the classrooms. And one thing that we see in the design of new schools is that special ed is much more integrated into the whole fabric of the school. So when we're looking at renovations, we try to make that happen to the extent possible that we can. Handicapped accessibility, we would characterize it by saying there's a moderate level of access in the buildings. Some parts of the buildings are better than others. Attempts have been made to make bathrooms accessible. However, let's just take this one for example. This is a bathroom in Little Harbor School. There are accessible stalls in this room, but the doorways into the room don't meet the dimensional requirements. So it's nice to have a stall in there, but if you can't get in there to begin with, then that's hard. And obviously people adapt, people make do, but if you're just looking at the code, that's one thing that you would definitely flag right there. And then, depends on the bathroom that you're looking at. The heights of the sinks may not be right on what they're supposed to be, and there's just a whole host of dimensional issues with, the heights of the equipment in the room, where the lavatory mirrors are, those sorts of things. So those are all issues that would have to be corrected if you were going to bring the bathrooms up to code. And then you have the accessible routes throughout the building to things like the stage. All 3 stages in all 3 buildings are not accessible. You would need to have a lift put in to get up to that upper level. And then the other big thing that's kind of pervasive is the hardware. We don't have a lot of the lever type hardware in many of the rooms in the building. And it looks like Kenny Lynch is changing them over as as old hardware breaks, he replaces it with compliant hardware. But it's something that would have to be looked at pervasively throughout. As I said, the mechanical systems, in all 3 buildings, our mechanical engineers sort of advised us that the systems are at the end of their service life, pretty inefficient and especially poor control over the mechanical systems. Mm-hmm. Now typically what you have are digitally controlled systems where everything can be controlled off of a computer from a remote location, and all of the dampers and so forth that open and close the air systems are all controlled remotely by the computer. So that's something that certainly would be worth looking at, and it's one of those upfront investments that would save a lot of money over the long term of the buildings. As I say, many of the rooms do not have nearly enough electrical outlets, so teachers are forced to put power strips down to plug in, and then you have overloaded circuits, and that's a fire hazard. So you got that issue is kind of in the background in all 3 schools, really. Ventilation in the rooms. We didn't do any air testing as part of our study, but just looking at the rooms and looking at the mechanical equipment, which are all, I think, almost without exception, the original unit ventilators, and just listening to the stories that we heard from faculty, there's not good ventilation in a lot of these spaces. And then some of the interior spaces that were originally storage or some other service that have been turned into education space, we've got a real difficult problem in there. Again, Little Harbor is a good example of that, where upstairs in the center is a kind of a core sped area, a special education area, and there are actually transfer grills cut into the walls up high to try and get some air circulating between the different rooms. So it's an issue. Hazardous material abatement in all three schools. We did a hazardous material assessment of all three schools, and of course there are hazardous materials present in all three schools, and I do know that the maintenance department has a very good handle on that situation and is doing ongoing small abatement projects in the schools as they can and as the dollars are available. And then again, no sprinkler systems. So we did quite a bit of work on educational programming, both in terms of, as I said, looking at the space issues in the buildings, but also talking to the principals of the schools and sending out questionnaires to the faculty to sort of get their ideas on how they envisioned the education being delivered in the schools and how the building was either helping or hindering, in most cases hindering, the delivery of the educational program. We're just going to concentrate really in this presentation on the facilities because that's sort of more our sphere in terms of our report. What these drawings are showing, these are floor plans of the three schools. I'll have the three schools up here. So this is Mary Dondero School, the first one, and what we're showing is the spaces in red are spaces that are significantly under the State Department of Education standards. Spaces in yellow are within 10% below the standard, and then spaces in green are at the standard or above. And most spaces were either just at the most green spaces were either just at the standard or just above. So we didn't have, we didn't have a lot of real huge overages at all. So very efficient buildings, I would say, in terms of the space and the floor plans. But as you can see, a lot of, does this thing have a laser pointer? Yes, it does. Here are the kind of the support facilities, the gymnasium, art, and music room. None of these spaces are within the standards right there. The stage is smaller than what we would like to see. Here's the library here. That's smaller than what we would like to see. And then this whole classroom wing here, this is the open classroom wing in this building. To get to these back classrooms, you have to walk through the classrooms in front of them. And these are just basically the movable partitions that have been left closed. I'm sure most of you know about this area here. And then this tiny little knuckle right here. This is the this is the administrative area, and as you can see, the principal's office is very small. The nurse's office in here. I'm not exactly sure why that's labeled green because I know that's pretty small compared to where it should be. This is the gymnasium in the middle, which is actually doing just fine in terms of its size. But again, a lot of the special education is concentrated in this one area right here. Oh, one other thing I should say, a lot of the special ed spaces we didn't give a color code to because there isn't really a state standard for special education. It's very much individually tailored to the school, to the individual school, not even the school district. So whatever the needs are of that school district, you try to customize the program to fit that. So those don't really have a color code, if you will. So this is New Franklin. A little better on the classroom space. Whoops. A little better on the classroom space. Most of the classroom space in this building is somewhere around 10% less than the state standard. There are a couple of rooms. I think currently this is being used as a kindergarten classroom, so that's actually way under. Kindergarten classrooms are supposed to be 1,200 square feet, not 900. So these two are the newer ones which are on the newest edition here, those are just fine. This one here doesn't have a bathroom and is quite a bit lower in square footage. And then let's see. The other piece to point out here, this is currently being used as the art room. This is basically just another classroom that has been more or less inhabited by the art program from what we could tell. And the art room really should be quite a bit bigger, should have specific cabinetry and storage facilities for art projects, and should have a very large size sink that a lot of kids can get around and use at the same time. And the sink for this one was just sort of tucked in the corner and was really almost like a residential size sink. So that's something. And then the music room here was a little bit under where it should be. And I think this was originally both art and music, and then art was moved up here when this addition was built. So that's kind of again, the big picture on this New Franklin School. And then Little Harbor School, we've left out the administrative portion, obviously, because that's not part of the DOE standards. But as you'll see in a minute, we're definitely looking at that space for other uses. This piece right here, this is the downstairs maintenance department, which is in the basement below this area here. So just imagine this floor plan is right below this floor plan. This is the central pod, which is the entrance art and music for the administration and the art and music. And then this is the lower floor of the classroom wing, and then the upper floor of the classroom wing. Again, as you can see, the classrooms are within 10% of that 900 square foot figure. So in this building, the classrooms are actually, all right. Not where you'd like to see them, but they're okay. Over here on the lower floor, these are the 4 kindergarten classrooms. So as I said before, those should be 1,200. They're 900, or they're a little less than 900. So those are significantly under where you'd like to see them. And then the media center is quite a bit smaller than what it should be for a population of this size. And art and music are right here and here, and those are both under where you'd like to see them at that size. And then this school is doing fine as far as the gymnasium here and the auditorium. This, of course, is that movable wall, so this can actually be opened up to be one big space. It's quite nice to have that flexibility there, and that's definitely a plus. So that's kind of the picture on the space needs and the space conditions of the buildings. What I'm going to do now is kind of zoom right in on the Little Harbor School, because obviously that's the school where there's a lot of attention being placed right now, and we're going to talk about the design option that we came up with for that school in terms of how to alleviate some of the space concerns there. So lots of colors here. I'll kind of go through and explain them. The blue are the classroom spaces, which are call them your primary education spaces. Purple is special education. Red are the service spaces and storage spaces, so bathrooms and custodial spaces and service spaces, that sort of thing. The green is the cafeteria and the kitchen, so the food service area, which happens in this building to have the stage attached to it. And then your athletic facilities are the orange amber space here. And then light blue is administration. This kind of ochre, olive color is the nurse's office. And then art and music are a tan color right there. And so the big move here, as we saw in the programming drawing, the previous drawing, the 4 classrooms that are being used for kindergarten are much smaller than they need to be. So one of the ideas here was to actually move the administration out of this building and put them in another space. There's talk about a space actually within this complex where they might go. The timing of that is in question right now, so how that would occur. But As it turns out, we have enough room to get the 4 kindergarten classrooms within this wing. We would actually have to reconstruct the corridor to make it wide enough to meet code, because right now it's too narrow. So you're really thinking about this whole L-shaped wing as a total gut and redo as these 4 classrooms. They're very strangely shaped classrooms from the standpoint of people who are used to rectangular shapes, but actually for kindergarten that might work out very well, because usually in a kindergarten environment you've got several small centers of activity around the room, and some of these spaces might lend themselves very well to having kind of a main area and then a couple of little story areas or nooks or places where activities can be set up off to the side. There's enough room to get bathrooms in for each of the bathroom cores in for each of the classrooms, so they would either share bathrooms in between 2 classrooms or have their own individual. I should point out that these are very schematic drawings here. These are not building design plans. They're just diagrams that are showing us some of the ideas that we would have. Because the classroom, the kindergarten classroom is kind of cut off from the rest of the building, it would really need its own separate entrance. You probably wouldn't want to have the kids traipsing through. I mean, obviously you can get through just the way you can now. You can get through the cafetorium when there isn't a class happening in there. So it's not as though it's completely cut off from the rest of the building, but for kids coming in the morning and then dismissal in the afternoon, you would probably want to have that separate entrance right here. And we're showing it with its own canopy and trying to give it some a life of its own and more of a character to it. Let's see. The other place where we would be doing some fairly heavy renovations is kind of rethinking the front office here and trying to make. Right now you've got several small spaces, none of which work really well. The idea would be to take all those partitions out and just give really 3 larger spaces that would work better for the main office, the principal's office, and then kind of a teacher's area for mailboxes and communications and that sort of thing. And then over in the classroom, really what we were looking at was, again, as I said in our preface, trying to get some of the special education spaces more to the outside of the building and get them more distributed around the other classrooms, with the other classrooms. Upstairs, we've opened up what's now the computer room here. In this plan, the computer brains, if you will, the server would stay pretty much right where it is. So that is a cost avoided of having to move all that infrastructure. But we really wanted to open up the computer more to the media center to get a little bit more interaction going between those 2 facilities. And then we're also trying to utilize some of these small spaces that were originally created. Upstairs, these are currently faculty rooms. They would remain faculty rooms in the new plans. Downstairs, somewhat underused, I think, and we would envision those becoming small group sped spaces, special education spaces there. The other big thing here is the amphitheater really does not meet any of the accessibility codes because of the steps down. So 2 thoughts for that would be either to create a ramp that gets you from the circulation space over to the stage for that accessibility. First of all, we would be taking the wall down, so that would become more of an open space, and it would be a central project space that all the classrooms would look into and be able to use. So either keep the floor as it is, or, and I think we tend to prefer this solution, perhaps even fill in the steps and just turn it into a much larger, flat, open area that could perhaps be used more effectively as a flexible space. So those are 2 ideas for that space that I've shown there. In terms of accessibility, we're talking about putting an elevator. There's actually a good bit of space in this open lobby here, so we're talking about a 3-stop elevator where you come in on the half level in the front of the elevator, and you either go up and go out the back for the upper level or go down and go out the back for the lower level. So it would be sort of like a freestanding tower right in the middle of what's now that open staircase there. And we think that that would work pretty well for getting some accessibility going. So with that, I just want to say we do have design ideas for the other two schools, but we were asked to kind of limit the discussion to Little Harbor School because we know that that's the one that's sort of on people's minds right now. One other thing I did want to say, going back to the discussion, what happens if the timing doesn't work out for moving the administrative wing over here? To create more, I mean, you can't create something out of nothing. To create more classroom space over here, we really can't, how do I say? We have the 4 kindergarten classrooms right here. If we can't move the kindergarten classrooms over there, we're really sort of in a very tough spot here. The main thing that we were trying to do is get the special education spaces, some of them, out of the middle and onto the outer sides here. A lot of this really does depend on being able to get the administration out of this space. And so I guess what I wanted to say is it's pretty imperative for this plan to work that without putting an addition on the building, that the administration be relocated. So that's something that I wanted to just kind of stress, that that's kind of the key linchpin of this whole design option right here. So I'd say, again, in conclusion, we were pretty pleased by what we saw with the facilities in terms of the general condition. These schools exhibit a lot of the same issues that you would see in any schools of this age and vintage, and the solutions are definitely within grasp, and what we've come up with are some fairly reasonable, cost-effective approaches for how to deal with them. So with that, I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Dexter, Kent.
So I'll start. I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you didn't see any sort of critical red flag issues related to student safety or anything else that require immediate addressing. Right?
No, we didn't.
Okay.
We didn't.
And have you, and the issues that you identified, have you begun to establish priorities yet for those, or is that sort of in a subsequent phase?
In a general sense, we have, but in terms of specifically labeling them, we haven't really done that sort of work just yet.
All right. And so my last 2 questions relate to specifically the Little Harbor design. Now, how many additional classrooms are we getting in that proposed design option?
Well, the number of classrooms is staying the same. What's happening is we're switching some of the special education space, which is now in the inside, to the outside, and then we're also giving teachers some more space for collaboration, which is something that they are sorely lacking right now. So that's a piece of the puzzle that doesn't exist now that we're trying to create.
So we're not adding any additional classroom capability. We're making what exists more effective and efficient.
That's right.
Effectively.
That's a very good summary. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Kent.
Couple questions. First one is that under the new Franklin, which, and first of all, I want to make a statement. You emphasize that we're looking at Little Harbor, and Little Harbor has a lot of lights on it right now. But as this goes as building projects, Little Harbor was the next in queue, because we had Darrow done in one phase, some things done. We had New Franklin had a major renovation and addition on it, and then the next one in queue under, the guidance that we've been put into, was New Franklin. It's not quite the lights that we have, I'm sorry, Little Harbor
Yep.
at this time. Because that is the next one, Little Harbor's the next one in queue to have stuff done to it. Is that correct? I want to make sure, because that's when we began this study, that's kind of where we were. Is that right?
Well, quite frankly, we wanted to do this study so we could make sure that that was the right order
Correct.
to be done.
Yeah, because Little Harbor has had very little done into it in the last 25-plus years. Next statement on this in question is that air quality, either we were misled or something's changed, because under air quality, just as recently as 2007, going into 2008, we had a complete air study done because we had issues as a board. The board took it and said, look, and we gave it to maintenance, and we gave it to a private company. I'm not sure which one. I can't remember off the top. And they looked at, because we had issues both, we have a great concern with where New Franklin is. It's between two major highways.
Sure.
What the air quality was. And we also said, let's look at Little Harbor. Dondero didn't get as big a study. I remember that it was really the two other schools looked at. And I agree. I think that the air quality, the stagnation of the air, the ventilation that we've had in there. So, I really do question where did you look at the studies that were done there in my 18 years on the board? I know there's been 2 and possibly 3 air quality studies done within elementary schools. Was that information at all available, or did you look?
We were not aware of those, no.
Yep.
No.
They were the
I was surprised.
most recent one was 2007 going into 2008, and then I know there was one done around 99, I believe it was. And again, so I like to have those looked at and see, because air stagnation in those buildings was always a question for any board that's ever been on here. So
Yeah.
please see if, and I'm hoping they're available. I mean, I can't imagine they're not somewhere within our archives.
Right. Well,
Yes?
one response I have to that, and this might actually clarify a question that Mr. Legg had just previously, in terms of the priority of looking at the schools. I mean, obviously, in all 3, the mechanical systems and the air quality was an issue, but in terms of the priority, we saw, in terms of the issues with the special education, how little space they had, that New Franklin was probably the one, in terms of priority of need, for which of the 3 schools had the most problems from the lens that we were looking at. New Franklin was the one that seemed to be, that rose to the top in those, looking at it with that set of values.
Because that's
So when I
matter of
say-
fact, going into that is that New Franklin has the largest elementary update of new classrooms
Right.
of any one of our buildings.
Right. It's the
And as we
newest
look
of
at
the
that,
facilities. Yeah.
and I kind of looked at your study there, and somehow I wasn't quite getting it, because looking at the diagram, I know that the cafeteria looks out towards the 95 highway. And I'm trying to get that, where on those new classrooms did we not meet standards? I'd be curious to.
It's not a question, the classrooms meet the standards for a normal classroom, but the program that has been put into them might
Which
not
has switched
match.
since.
Yeah, yeah.
They're not, that, it was not originally kindergarten
Yeah,
there.
the
it was
one that I was picking on was the art room, which is in the back corner. That looked like it was just originally a classroom, and art has been assigned to that room, and an art room should be bigger than a normal classroom.
How did the cafeteria, I couldn't quite get it on, I should have interrupted the diagram on that. I wasn't sure, because I was getting confused when I looked at it a little. And then I have one other.
There we go. Yeah, so the cafeteria is right here. That
Okay.
is fine.
And it's just that one red room that would be one of the newer
this,
classrooms.
this one right here is one of the newer classrooms, right? And that's just
So
being
it's the
used as a-
program does not fit the room, it's not the room.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And lastly, we go back to Little Harbor and the switching of administration. Also, I mean, part of that is that there's a lease within part of this building at, City Hall, that until that lease goes out, and I'm going to say 2015, I don't know if that's the
18.
year, 2018, So if it's a phase-in project to move the administration on up, is that a doable, or is that not a recommended? Is it doable to say, look, we'll do all this knowing that in 2018 to 2020, we're going to move administration to a different location, or would you not recommend that?
Well, I'm kind of shooting from the hip here, but you could renovate these 4 classrooms and make them into what they will be for a grade 1 through 5 classroom, but still use them for kindergarten for the time being. And then when this space comes available, you could do that renovation and then move them over into spaces that are going to be compliant, that would be 1,200 square feet. So you're working with them as renovated spaces here, but not up to square footage standard.
I mean, it comes to a cost factor.
What's that?
I mean, it comes to a cost factor of what we can plan on for the next 8 years.
Right. Right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Good questions.
You mentioned outdoor educational space, and it looked like on the Little Harbor drawing you had put something there. I wondered what you had in mind.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. In the back, right here between the 2 wings, as you probably know, the land slopes down right there, and then there's a driveway, and then you have the fencing, obviously, and then the water. We were thinking, wouldn't it be a nice place to put an amphitheater that would actually work with that grade and have a little stage at the bottom, and then you've got the comings and goings of the maintenance department here, so you might want to actually screen that with some landscaping on one side or maybe on both sides. But it seemed like a nice, relatively quiet place where you could put an amphitheater. You've got Ma Nature as your backdrop right there. It's just a beautiful view right there of the harbor itself. So that was one idea we had for that outdoor space created by the buildings. And then over here, we just sort of have a circle indicating if the kindergarten is going to go over here, it would be good to have a play area for them directly outside the door where they could go, something fenced in so they're not dealing with traffic and so forth. So those were sort of the 2 thoughts that we had.
And the other playground would stay the same?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then maintenance would stay where it is, underneath?
Barring any other issues that might come up as we start to look at it more seriously, yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Tom, would it be a fair statement to say that through this process that we've gone through, the recommendations that you're putting forth are doable with the buildings that we have, in saying that these are good enough quality buildings, the size and the shape, that this would be a worthy renovation project versus the alternative of saying, do we actually look at rebuilding a school, knowing that there's could be some significant cost differences, or maybe the delta is not as big as one might think, because as you delve into some significant renovations, sometimes it's easier to build new than it is to renovate or do some significant work. Could you just comment on?
Yeah. In all 3 cases, the design options that we came up with, as I said in my introductory statements, we were sort of purposefully looking at them as fairly practical solutions, trying to do a couple things, trying to avoid additions if possible, trying to work within the existing footprint if possible. When we looked at the phasing of how we would actually do the projects, trying to avoid using portable classrooms, so trying to do a lot of work during the summer periods, and trying to use existing facilities as much as possible to minimize the amount of demolition that would have to happen, and trying to keep costs down that way. So those were all factors that went into the designs. Now, having said all that, are there compromises? Are the plans perfect? Yeah, there are compromises, and no, the plans are not perfect. Would a new school be, a more perfect way of looking at the programs? Of course, it would be. It would be easier to design a new school. The buildings are all in good shape, as I said. We had a structural engineer come through and look at all of the structures. There are no concerns with the structures of the buildings. There are some very minor issues that are pointed out in the report that, if not addressed, would get worse and might become serious, but right now they're fine. So, yeah, the building, what you've got are 3 serviceable buildings that are worthy of renovating.
Thank you. And then the other piece that you touched on was really the external spaces. And I know this project really addressed the buildings, the interior use.
Primarily, yeah.
But I know we had conversations about it. Could you just touch on the fact that there's some creative ways that you've looked at and made some just suggestions that these spaces actually do work, and there's things that we can do in terms of specifically egress, the playgrounds, and shifting some things around that
Right.
the spaces and that we have could accommodate those types of changes.
I'll look at, to kind of illustrate the example, we'll look at New Franklin School. One of the issues that we talked about there, the circle is right here. The bridge over US 1 is right there. I don't know if you guys can see the laser pointer down below at the bottom of the screen there. So the circle is out front here, and then the parking area is over here. And there were some discussions about how do we bring the buses in to get the kids. What's that? Do we have the board? Yeah. It's going to be hard to see, but. This is the design option for New Franklin, and really what we looked at were actually filling in the rest of this forecourt here and turning that back into art and music, and actually filling in this space here and this space here with more program for the administration, and then this is actually special education over here. We also turned this area, or we're proposing turning this area into another outdoor theater space, trying to, I'm going to start feeding back the mic here, trying to turn this face of the building into kind of like an outdoor stage right here. And then we had discussions. It's sort of hard to be specific about the discussions without a site plan here, but we had discussions about how were we going to improve the, as I said before, the bus circulation, perhaps dropping off here in sort of a donut shape, getting car traffic coming into the main entrance, or kids coming out of cars coming into the main entrance here, and then trying to perhaps get the buses to circulate out and around. Right now, there's an entranceway to the site that comes in the back here, and if we could get one-way circulation going around the school to get all of the buses going out in the same direction, that might be a good thing. Now, having said that, one of the issues is right now the playground is pretty much directly adjacent to the school here. So the question is, if you make the circulation this way, you're cutting off the playground. Maybe the thought is to bring the playground over to this side of the school where you've got a lot more space. It's underutilized, and is that something that could be done? So that was one of the discussions that we had. We had kind of a similar discussion on Dondero, which was really more, I would say, working with the existing vehicular patterns and just trying to improve things a little bit and clarify things a little bit. So.
And last question, just regarding the proposed changes at Little Harbor with the kindergarten. Is that, in your estimation, is that a feasible project that if we had room for the central administration and the appropriate funds, that we could accomplish that type of a move within a school year to be prepared for, say, the following fall, if that space is something that we desperately need?
Yeah, it would depend. entirely on the time that you started, but just saying hypothetically,
Yeah.
if we wanted to start something like that, if you gave us a directive to start working on the design, we could probably have a design finished and be ready to bid by next spring. And if we're just talking about the renovation of the administrative, that L, into kindergarten, that could probably be accomplished in a summer session. It would be, it would be a push, but it could be done.
Thinking about, preparation for fall 2012.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Carol.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
My understanding of Little Harbor School is that originally it was designed to be an open concept school, and that they found that that wasn't working. So they put up walls to create classrooms. And my understanding was always that those walls were not necessarily created in the way that you would normally do a wall, and so that there's a lot of noise in those classrooms. Did you make any findings or observations in that regard, and what do you suggest we do about that, if anything?
Yes, absolutely. Many of the walls between the classrooms are actually the movable partitions themselves. It was designed as a totally flexible, open plan where the teachers could open and close the walls depending on what kind of a lesson they were giving. And they might do a team lesson with their neighbor or something like that. So pairs of classrooms actually have, let me just forward here. Yeah, pairs of classrooms. This wall here is actually just the movable partition. So it's not very acoustically high performing. So when we look at the floor plan, we're actually assuming that that wall comes out and a permanent wall gets built in its place. And then also, also on the ends, the end walls would also have permanent walls built, and that's where we would try to concentrate storage for the classroom on the inside, and then maybe the kids on the outside, or vice versa, depending on how we wanted to structure that. But that's what these little H shapes are here: is storage on the inside, storage on the outside. So one of the other things about this, Steve and I have been talking about this project and how it's very difficult once you get started with a renovation project to just do a little bit here and not touch the whole thing. A good example of that is if the mechanical system for this building is designed as if it were an open building. So when you start to chop it up into small spaces, you really have to radically re-envision the mechanical system. So as part of closing these classrooms up and turning them into proper classrooms with 4 walls, you're talking about a new ducted system to get the air into those spaces. So.
Thank you.
So, since you've briefly showed us the Little Harbor 1 designed option, and New Franklin, and we've been spending a lot of time in Little Harbor, I'd ask you just to briefly take us through your design option for Dondero.
Absolutely.
Just so that they don't feel left out or we don't leave them out.
Thank you.
So with Dondero, again, the two main issues were creating classroom spaces for the kindergartens that were of a decent size, and also repositioning some of the special education spaces around the building so that they would be more effectively serving the populations directly. So one idea here was to actually create a small addition off the front end of this wing and create this as kind of a new kindergarten wing here. Right now, these are both kindergarten classrooms, so it would be 1, 2, 3 kindergarten classrooms, and this one would become first grade. Then we get first grade here together, so we've got all the little kids down in one wing down there, and then they've got a decent amount of special education space right next to them, and then a little teacher's area and tutorial area right there. These spaces here would be the second grade classes, and then this space, which is currently a special education space, would remain. I think the program shifted slightly here. No, that's still sensory. That's the sensory room right there. Much like in the other programs, the administrative core would have to grow a little bit to just get those guys some badly needed meeting space. And then also, guidance is currently up here. We would bring guidance down so it's right next to the rest of the administration. And then the nurses' suite would also be in here as well. And then this wing would become 3rd and 4th grade right here, also with a resource room next to it. And then 5th grade would be over here. And we would be re-envisioning some of the special education space that's currently here. It's still, the purple program, but slightly different configuration of that space. And then we're not proposing changing the size of the library, but we wanted to put a resource room next to the library and maybe create some kind of an opening there so there was a little bit more of a direct correlation between the resource function and the library itself, so they could perhaps share media between the two of them. And then also up here, both art and music are pretty severely undersized, so there's a small addition that's popping out. The two functions actually switch so that we can get a kiln room in here in the middle of the building right there, and then music goes here. And then actually this looks like a slightly older drawing because we've also proposed as an option creating a larger gymnasium, basically taking this gymnasium down and creating a larger gymnasium that would pop all the way out even right here. So,
Tom, can you also talk about the hallway going through 3rd and 4th?
Yes, thank you. The 3rd and 4th, right now, as I said, you have to walk through the classrooms to get from one to the other. We looked at the structure of this building, and it is possible. There's a double line of steel columns going right down the middle of the building, so it almost looked like they were planning for it to be a central corridor, but they didn't build it that way. So all of this stuff is non-structural and can actually be taken out, and so we can just put a corridor right down the middle. Now, what you end up with are some smaller classrooms. These are all still undersized for the standard, but at least they're all working better. So that's a good example of a practical solution that, you don't end up with the perfect, but you end up with something that's more workable. And then for exterior space, this school already has a garden. I think it's located here, so we left that alone, left it where it is, because that's a very nice amenity in that courtyard. But also looked at these trees as a possible setting for another one of these outdoor performance areas or outdoor classroom space, somehow trying to manipulate the landscape in there to make that a little bit nicer space there. And we also showed on this plan a greenhouse out here. No reason why, each of the schools couldn't or shouldn't have a greenhouse as part of integrating, biology into the classroom. So those are some other ideas that we had there.
Thank you.
Ann?
When you were talking about the outdoor theater area, is that in the area where the garden is now?
It wouldn't replace it, it would be next to it. Yeah, but it's in that courtyard.
Side by side?
Yeah.
Okay, the 3rd and 4th grade area, I spent 30 years in the middle room of one of those. In 1973, that school burned down, and when the school was originally built, there was a corridor there.
Oh.
So when they rebuilt the school on the same pad, they built it without the corridor.
Interesting.
So it gave more space.
Right. Yeah, the classrooms theoretically got bigger, but now you had to walk through one to get to the other.
Right, and then lots of windows on the side and access out.
Yeah, I would say, obviously, of the three, Dondero is the one that has the best access to natural light and views. That one has nice windows in it. Yeah.
So if I could just begin to sum up, I just want to be clear in my head some of the main points of what I hear you're saying. So clearly the schools are worthy of renovation. Structurally, everything's fine.
Yeah.
The mechanical, electrical systems are a priority. Ventilation is something that really needs to be looked at. And I think the other piece, the biggest piece that I hear you talking about is relating to classroom spaces is, A, we're not really adding any classrooms really to the buildings, but we're bringing all classrooms up to code, especially in areas where programming has made the what might be an adequately sized classroom undersized.
Right. I wouldn't say bringing them up to code. We are doing the best we can in a practical way to bring them as close to the standards as possible. Yeah, because there's a lot of places, like I say, there's a lot of places where there had to be compromises in order to make the existing plan work, but we're just trying to make it work better.
And so one of the things, I don't know if this applies, one of the things we learned from the process of the middle school is that some projects are worthy of state support. I don't know if these are in any way. But if classrooms are not, if there's any renovations that are done and then classrooms are not up to state standards, at least with the middle school, what I remember was that there was an issue that the state wouldn't pay for it if it wasn't up. So I don't know if that was part of the consideration, or if you know if in fact there's any state, in the future, any state funding that would work, that would help the district out in this kind of building or renovation. Right. Do you know anything about that?
I don't really know anything about the current situation in New Hampshire. What we've had some discussions, and the outlook for state funding is pretty bleak in general.
Right, but we are looking multiple years out.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. But then, so the issue really is getting classrooms up to as large, as close to standards as possible.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Yep.
Okay. And the other part is special ed spaces, either the size of them and or the location, repositioning them closer to where they're serving.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, great.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Good work. So if we could move along with the agenda, I'm sure we will come back to school facilities conversation. I just want to see if we can get through some things. So superintendent's report, just move on.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, in your materials, you have a list of maintenance projects that were completed this summer, as well as policy committee minutes of July 20th. You have a letter of resignation from Travis Park, who's been a sixth grade teacher at the Portsmouth Middle School. I've also included a memo issued by the New Hampshire Retirement System, basically sharing what the recertified employer contribution rates will be effective, actually last month, August 1st. And, that contingency was expected, with the city manager and the council, and so hopefully that doesn't put us in any more difficult financial situations, kind of resolved at the city level. And finally, I've enclosed a memo from John Frederick, the Director of Parking and Transportation, as well as Steve Parkinson, the Director of Public Works. And basically in that memo, he explains that their recommendation is to not proceed with bike lanes in the Elwyn Park area, as it would require significant reconstruction and or ordinance changes. So those are the 5 items in the superintendent's report. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about that.
Yes, Tom.
Just a question on the retirement. The rates that are on the sheet just reflect the coming year and the following year after that. Is there an example of what we're currently or what the increase is going to be?
In terms of dollars, what you can see my chicken scratch on that and what it was prior to that.
Oh, okay. So, got it. So it's
so one went up, one went down.
One went up, one down. Okay.
Right.
Okay. I wasn't sure if that was. Thank you.
But in dollars, in terms of dollars, Steve, I don't know if you could carry.
Just order of magnitude.
Order of magnitude about 300,000.
Okay. Right.
Slightly higher than that, but.
Yes.
I had a question about the safe routes to school. So if they're suggesting that we not do those bike routes, then is there another idea for improving access to the school?
he just shared that memo, and I said I'd pass it on to the board, so I don't know if he's had any other conversations. I think he was trying to act on the initial recommendation coming out, which was to put in a bike lane, and the difficulty with the parking, and how you'd have to either change the ordinance or do some significant, because folks, I guess, are accustomed to parking on the streets there,
Yep.
and he thought that would make it a more dangerous situation to install a bike path.
Well, Safe Routes to Schools, I understand it was a grant that the city got. And so what happens to grant money that doesn't get used? Are we able to use it to do something else? Does it get returned? You know, sort of, I guess I'm curious about where Safe Routes to School sits right now, and we may not even know.
We don't know. We haven't had a full committee in many months.
Ann?
I just had a question for Steve. Going back to that retirement memo, under the Group 1 teachers, does that mean we're going to have 1% savings for the Group 1 teachers? The other one went up 0.27%, and the Group 1 teachers went down 1.21%. Are we going to see some savings in that line? Ed's
No.
shaking his head no. Okay, I just wanted some
No,
clarification.
based on volume, it doesn't,
It just,
it doesn't help.
okay, thank you.
I just follow up with what Leslie was bringing up. I'd like to get us an accounting
Yeah, I was going to ask.
of the Safe Routes to School funding, because we put time into it many years ago. And when the funding first, because I think Clay actually sat on it the first time, in his first go-around. And then I don't believe it's got to be a fund that's sitting somewhere. I don't believe it sits within the school fund. I believe it sits within the city. But
Well, that's the second thing that we haven't spent the money on, because we bought bike racks to put in Little Harbor, and then I think it was the EPA said we couldn't do that.
right.
So-
So I mean, just the counting of that funding, so we can say, we need to look at it, what we can use. I mean,
Well,
the
can we do
parameters
something
are pretty
else?
limited, but I'm sure we can figure out many sidewalks or whatever.
Right, can we do something else? Can we use it to paint crosswalks? I mean, I don't know, but can we use it for something else?
I know from my involvement with it, there's a whole host of things that the Safe Routes
yeah.
can be applied to. So if anything, I'd like to see if there's something that we can get involved or reinvigorate those discussions, with the Safe Routes to School, because I know there's a whole host of egress issues that have been identified. There's a whole host of options that have been presented. We have materials out there. It's really just a matter of taking a look and applying some of the money to some of the projects that are already have been identified.
And I do remember when we applied for this originally, it does have an expiration time period to it. I don't know what it is, but it's within another 5 years that I believe that, you've got to utilize it, whatever.
That's what I wonder. And also I wonder, can we put the bike racks that we no longer can put at Little Harbor, can we use them at the middle school or at some other school?
I'll talk to John.
Okay. Yes, Ann.
I wondered whether or not the work that's being done to widen the sidewalk by Little Harbor, whether that might be part of that project. Because I know that they were widening that whole area when they didn't have the one-way street anymore.
To make space for bicycles.
Yeah, would that be part of it?
I don't believe so, Ann, but let me talk to John and get an accounting and find out exactly where
It would
project
it would make
status is.
sense.
And it's- Yes.
That's a good point.
So in other words, if it wasn't part of it, it will be now.
Well, I don't
that's a
wanna
good
waste it,
idea.
but use it.
Mitch,
Yes,
just a comment about the Safe Routes to School. I don't know if this would be at all possible, but I'm wondering if it was driven more from the school department and less, a volunteer committee of people from various different places, because it doesn't seem to be moving forward. They don't seem to be able to address how much money do we have, what are we going to use it for, and this is how we're going to make it happen.
think it was
It's not
city
happening,
planning,
and I think that it should happen. I think we've applied for the grant, we've gotten it. There's other money we could apply for, but yet it doesn't seem to go anywhere. And so I guess I'm just wondering if a different composition of a committee or just somehow figuring out a way to get the stuff done that doesn't just get lost in committee.
Right.
Which just seems like it's what's been happening.
So maybe what you're asking is a little accounting of whose committee is this? So it's not a school board committee, right? It's a city committee.
It's a city.
And so, Rebecca, since you sat on it last.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there are definite records of the amount of money and what the projects go to. The stalling point has been when the city eliminated the position of the traffic engineer. She was sort of the driving force behind this, and we met at Public Works, and the Public Works secretary recorded all the minutes, and then her position was eliminated and she was let go. So we didn't have anybody to fill that in. And then originally there were 3 city councilors on it, and then the election happened in turnover. And there was also someone from the Traffic and Safety Committee on it who then moved out of town, was no longer on Traffic and Safety, and by default no longer on Safe Routes to School. So until the mayor reappoints those positions, we haven't had a quorum. And it's been hard because I don't know whose committee it is. I think the city wants the school to take it over, which is fine. However, we need someone who's a licensed traffic engineer who can write the grants and apply to the state. So that's where it is, unfortunately.
Well, which then, I think, that was very helpful to understand that. And that's where then, again, I think perhaps the superintendent needs to meet with the city manager, and the school department and the city need to come together and have a conversation about, how are we going to do this with the traffic engineer no longer being on staff? Who's taking over her workload? What about this other person? And I mean, I have to say, I don't think it's acceptable to say, well, oh, this person, we lost this person and someone else left. I mean, we have to, figure out how to make this happen. So I would suggest that the superintendent and the city manager have a discussion about this, and is it a city committee or is it a school committee, and who's going to do what and how to make it go forward.
I agree. He's already got that down.
Okay.
To have that conversation.
One more quick thought.
Yeah.
With the construction at the middle school, I wonder if there's also a way to use it to deal with the kids walking to school there. Crossing guard. I know we can't use it for people, but crosswalks, at least painting new crosswalks in places and things like that. Because that's a pretty tricky thing. I was looking at that today and thinking about all the kids on, next Wednesday who have to get into that school, by walking. So.
Okay. So, seeing nothing else about the superintendent's report, we'll move on to district financials. Mr. Bartlett.
Okay, in your packets, you had the year-end June report, as well as a, a narrative, which I'll just try to hit the high points on. After all was said and done, and we did all the analysis and all the reconciliations, with all the transfers that we would be turning back to the city, $60 out of this year's budget.
Well done.
And then there is $2,700 that's in last year's, prior year's encumbrance fund, which, and that was set aside to take care of, prior year encumbrances, and we ended up with $2,700 in there, which will also be turned back to the city. I think, basically this was accomplished with the help of, the staff and the teachers and everybody throughout the year, because they allowed us to be, they were flexible, and they exhibited good fiscal control this past year. So we were able to have some flexibility so that we could redirect some funds to the pressure points, and without having to implement a real hard freeze. Usually what happens at the end of the year, we go through, and as we're reconciling all the grants and the other non-general fund revenues, we try to take as much advantage as we can of those to take pressure off the general fund as well. By and large, the net results from the salary and benefits area allowed us to transfer some of that money over to the operations area and come out in the position that I've described so far. You've already received the list of projects some of which we have done and some of which are in process and will be done during vacations through the year. Part of that funding is by moving some of that money over. That list is a result of, we always wait till the end of the year, but we always try to direct some of that because that's always the area, the infrastructure that ends up being cut up front. So if we can manage the budget well enough, we can redirect some of that money and have some of those projects. So you've seen that list. Things such as, coming in, reducing our substitute budget to a lower target and having everybody put in a good effort and come in, more than 5% under budget in those areas. Other salary lines were favorable due to several staff members leaving before the end of the year, so we had some savings there. Every year when we put together the budget for the sick leave at term fund, we don't know exactly how much of that fund will be actually distributed to employees and be subject to retirement and tax, as opposed to the portion of the fund that goes into the stabilization portion that the city holds. So, and again, this year we came out on the favorable and positive side of that, which gave us a little more flexibility. The biggest pressure points this year, obviously, was the special ed area, as it always is. If you recall, several years ago, we set up a situation where we put a transfer from the general fund to Fund 27 and the tuition and fees fund to try to keep that in balance and in a positive light. And so we originally started off making that transfer at $500,000, and then we tried to cut it back to $400,000. And in spite of our best efforts and some increased revenues, there was a lot more pressure in that area than we had expected this year. So we increased the transfer this year from $400,000 to just over $500,000. So if you look at the details of the report, you'll see in the bottom that that transfer has been shown here, which will not totally eliminate the operating loss in that area for this year, but it gets it pretty close to even, which was the goal of setting up that transfer in the first place. Mm-hmm. Can take any questions that people may have.
Two things. One is Steve, I think your statement towards budget makers, trying to keep about a negative 5%, you came close this year. $66, and it'll be the ultimate pessimist of looking at next year's budget. We're already looking at alterations due to the No Child Left Behind and so forth. And as we go to our budget makers, or through you go to the budget makers and say, hey, look where the savings are. It does paint a semi-bleak picture, not knowing how close we're going to be each year. So I ask a way off question on that. First of all, is that let's say we owed $66 next year, which would be nice. What's the negative towards us if we can't meet that budget? I know some of the answers to that, but I'm asking that as a public sector right now. If we're $100,000 over because we've done everything we were told, and I have one area that I do want to ask. Do we have to ask for that funding prior to the end of the school year? Because you don't know. You didn't know until today, or very recently, you were $66. You didn't know whether you're going to be $66 over or $66 under. What would be the scenario if it was the other way around?
Well, from an operating standpoint, I'd try my hardest to make sure it was at least zero and not $66 over, one way or another. But realistically, technically, we would have to go back for a supplemental appropriation to balance.
But you would not know it until this point in time of a budget process, because you really don't know. I mean, you'd have an indication, I suppose.
I've had indications, and as I have tried every month, after we get past the first of the year and to get closer, there are indications of where the pressure points are. And so we just, we do our best to manage it and, try to meet those pressure points. If we ended up in a situation where we couldn't make enough adjustments early enough to do that, then I think we'd have no choice but to go and ask for a supplemental appropriation to be able to have it come out even. Yes.
It wouldn't have taken much where you were basically going to the budget maker saying, hey, look, cut what you can this year. I mean, without them doing that, we were able to do it because of their hard work and sacrifices on the students. I mean, that's really what happens. I mean, there were things that could have been used, absolutely. And one of those pressure points that I look at does fall into special ed, and every year, and it's this fluctuation of out-of-district tuition. It is from what I indicate, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's the largest negative we had this year. And it tends to be the largest negative we always have. I think it's something that the board needs to work with both legal and special ed and say, hey, look, what can we do to make it? $319,000 is a big number to be off, and it's not any certain person's fault, because that could be 2 or 3 students that can actually jack that price up if we have to be court ordered. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, that's where the pressure points are. That's the hardest point. That's where that extra money, the transfer comes out of that section. We manage as we go along. We've made efforts again this year. The administrative team, management team, essentially has gone through and tried to reconfigure, a lot of special ed areas to try to, get those costs a little more predictable.
But one of the non-predictabilities that's been hitting that department is that the state has cut back its contribution over the last 7 years, chipped away at reimbursement. Is that not our catastrophic aid?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Mm-hmm.
So as long as they keep chipping away at catastrophic aid, we're not really at fault. We're only doing what our ability is.
Yeah, we're required to provide those services, and we do our best to provide them at
the state has an obligation, and the feds do too, but they don't quite see it the same as us, I guess.
Yes, Tom.
I just want to point out and just highlight the fact that the substitute line, we had put forth a stretch goal, and not only did we meet it, but we exceeded it. And so if you take a look at the fact that we are giving $60 back on our budget, we were able to get $128,000 just by having teachers be at school versus bringing a substitute in. It still leaves $328,000 on the table, and that's not cutting services. That's not removing somebody out of the classroom. So part of it is to look back at that number and say, are there some other things that we can look at? Because that's a hard, but very variable number that could be looked at. So whether there's an interesting incentive, obviously people need time for bereavement, for sickness, for other things that are going to cost the substitute line, but to continue to find creative ways to reduce that number could also provide some easement in the coming year. That's my only thought for the administration.
So, Steve, I just have 2 quick questions. So, one is, how much longer are we required to pay accrued benefits to people when they retire? Doesn't that phase out at a point? For
through the sick leave at term fund?
Right.
There are several options for them, and generally, as the retirement system changes some of the rules, some of those payments will change, because in the past there have been choices on how they can be distributed, and all the choices that I'm aware of have been the entire sum owed had been paid within 60 days of their retirement because of the way it's counted in the retirement system. if the retirement system changes the rules drastically as to what can be included and what can't be included, I suppose that could, in fact, change. But generally, it's been my experience since I've been here that, they take it in 3 years, 2 years, 1 year a lump sum when they're done. Those are like the three scenarios. But by and large, everybody's taken their money out that's due them by the time they retired. If I understood your question right, but maybe I didn't understand your question.
Maybe I was always under the impression that at some point that option would disappear.
Well, yes, because it's any post-96 employee is not entitled to that benefit.
Right.
So once all those pre-96 people retire,
that's kind of what
that will go away. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. Yes.
So it's hard to predict how, they could work a long time.
20 more years.
20 more years.
They could,
96,
yes.
2006.
Joe Einstein could live about another 100 years.
Okay.
Yes, but eventually that fund will not be needed in its current configuration, but I'll probably be retired before that happens.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so nothing else about financials. We'll move on to old business. So we have set aside some time to discuss the issue of school choice. But before I do that, I'd like to ask the superintendent to walk us through the memorandum that he's written to us.
Yes, as a result of a follow-up to last Tuesday night's meeting, I provided a memo in your packet. You'll recall we were directed to find monies to hire 6 additional paraprofessionals from the FY12 existing budget. We estimate that cost to be, based on a 5-hour para step 2 with the benefits that are provided, health and dental, to be $125,248. Now, there'll be some variance there, of course, because you'll have some folks who will opt for the health insurance. Charlie may end up hiring folks at step 6. So there's some $35,000 to $5,000 difference if you hire someone to top a scale. You'll recall we identified some $86,000 as the difference between monies that we had budgeted for certain positions and those that we have actually hired for the 2011-12 school year. Of course, those changes are due to folks we knew were retiring. We put a plug number in at Master Step 7, folks that have subsequently taken leaves of absence, as well as folks who have resigned, like Mr. Park did this evening. So we've gone through and we've done our hiring, and that netted us from what we had carried in budget to what we have, some $86,000 in budget. Additionally, we're able to use $21,000 in federal Title I monies that were allowed to be used for school choice transportation. So what that will do is ultimately free up $21,000 in the general fund, the operating fund, so that provides us another 100, and now we're getting closer. And then the final piece that I mentioned in the memo is we consulted with our facilities director. We had placed in the budget a replacement at the new Franklin School for a backup boiler. We were carrying $58,000 for that capital improvement in the current year's budget. We've talked with Mr. Lynchy, Steve, and they feel like they could forego that, that we can get another serviceable year, just currently operating as we are. So that takes us to about $165,000 in budget to be able to purchase those 6 additional paraprofessionals without additional expense beyond what we currently have in the FY12 general fund budget. In the memo, I also talked a little bit about long-term issues, so if I may, I'll just spend a minute or two talking about that. I did, following that meeting, have another conversation with Commissioner Barry. And I think the board had said we need to explore a waiver option. Well, I want to be clear that the waiver would be something that the state would pursue for the entire state, and suggesting a new accountability system in lieu of what we're currently using with kneecaps and adequate yearly progress. She said the state's well poised to do that. She expects a decision to be made later on in September. That would change where we find ourselves today if that happens. Absent that, I did talk to the commissioner and say, but nonetheless, it's quite clear that it's the state who determines a policy that would allow children to opt from Title I schools to a non-Title I if they're all in CINE status for more than 2 years. She said she's looking at that guidance as well. She's going to, at the next superintendent's conference, have a general forum about this. And I think, looking absent a waiver and heading down that direction, I think she's likely then to change the state's guidance or policy on that. So the way I look at that is that there are two ways that we can avoid being in the situation we find ourselves in next year. I did also want to talk a little bit about space issues, and you saw the presentation from Tom Hengelsberg. I think nonetheless, that children are entitled to remain for the entire grade span. So notwithstanding a low K enrollment expected again next year, where we might move on some high numbers to the middle school and take in smaller numbers of K again next year, we still have classroom needs at Little Harbor School to sustain those if we're going to remain true to our enrollments 20 or under in grades K to 3. So, we've talked to Tom. Can we, if you kept the K classroom space you currently have, can you create 4 more classrooms where we are without going full in? Are there other accommodations that could be done in those central locations? So we're trying to explore from Tom opportunities to create some space that doesn't require portables so that we can see those children through their tenure at the Little Harbor School. And then the final piece I want to talk a little bit about is Dondero. We've met with Principal Callahan. And I have to say that folks who came and chatted with me about their reasons, I think they all felt very strongly about Ms. Callahan. We've talked about a plan as to how we go forward in terms of, because I think directionally, Dondero had a great year last year. And I think we can build upon that. And there are areas, of course, that we can all get better at. I don't care what school we're talking about. Each of our schools has area for improvement. So we've kind of put together, I think, a pretty good administrative plan. We're going to talk with staff as they come back next week, and we'll report that out to you in a more transparent way as we move along. But we want to keep the lines of communication open with families that are there and what the program is. And that's essentially what I wrote in my memo. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about it.
Yes, Rebecca.
I have 2 questions. One is the $21,000 from Title I.
Yes.
So I understand the concept of taking it from here and applying it and being able to use general fund, but does that mean that our Title I program will be down $21,000?
So
it will not be funded by that amount?
So you're required to set aside 20% of what your title fund monies are for schools that are in CINI status. Historically, in the last few years, we've used that entire set-aside amount exclusively for supplemental educational services, i.e. the after-school programming that might take place at Sylvan or Little Harbor Learning. What that means is we can now take that 20% set-aside, a piece of that money, for school choice transportation.
Okay.
That's the intent of that. So what it will mean, the impact will be, there'll be less children afforded the opportunity to get supplemental educational services.
So we're trading education
We have to
for
prioritize,
transportation.
that's correct.
Okay. And then my other question, and forgive me if you answered this last week, is with the needing to hire additional paraprofessionals, if 30 some odd students are coming from one school, you would think that their staff would then follow? And so why are we hiring additional? I just need clarification on that.
Well, it's just the way the various grade levels come and impact the current grade configurations at Little Harbor. I mean, so I shared a PowerPoint last week with staff so you could see that I think there were 6 coming into K, and the Ks actually remain fine. They remain about 16 or 17. But there are impacts of, with just 9 children coming to grade 2, that creates class size, which we already thought was high, at 23, 24.
And so you're going to leave the para at Dondero.
We're not taking any resource away from the 2, Dondero and New Franklin, to achieve this. These are 6 additionals that we've, as I shared with you earlier here, found in budget to new hires.
And is it because the 30 students are spread out over
Rebecca,
K
yes.
through 5?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Oh, sure. There were 2 grade levels already anticipated to be above 20, just as we did it last year when we did our budget.
Okay.
Mitch?
Yes.
So Rebecca asked one of my questions, which is good. My other question is it says 5 hours for the paras, so they're not there the whole day?
No, we're looking to deploy them particularly at our literacy, math, and intervention blocks.
Okay, so they're there for kind of a specific time
purpose,
frame.
exactly.
Okay, and a specific purpose. And that was one of my other questions is, so for reading support, it's not a Title I school at Little Harbor, so the paras that are coming in will be targeting sort of those
They'll be in,
specific areas.
the new paras will actually be general ed support in the first, second, and third grades. Not special ed.
Right. No, I understand that.
Okay.
But it sounds like they'll have specific.
Right, we're looking to actually use them as efficiently as we possibly can.
Yes, Kent.
I'm going to go back because it was one of the questions I had that Rebecca brought up. And I understand, believe me, the 21,000 was an offset that was used under Title I, that we were able to use it until, for educational needs, until we had a choice issue. And the choice issue comes up, and now you're taking, and we are taking it, I think, I want to emphasize, we're taking money that had been used for the last 3 years, correct? 3 years, 4 years. Well,
Certainly in all my years.
3 years, okay, 3 to 4 years. We'd be going into the 4th year.
Yeah.
Okay, that was used to help increase educational areas of deficiencies that may have been at Don Darrow. Now we don't have that 21. I want to make sure the public is well aware that there's a $21,000 deficit that was going, and we don't have any way to replace that out of our own general fund to give to those kids who highly needed that after-school activity. In fact, I think it's one that we've all talked about at this table, is that we want to see more of that activity. But now we don't have any way to replace that, and granted, we used it for the last 3 years, and it was to our advantage. That doesn't happen now because a large portion of that's gone. There's still some money there, I'm assuming, but nowhere near as much as in the past.
As an example, last year there was $109,000 in cine set-aside monies that were used for supplemental ed services. So think about that as taking $21,000 off of that. That's what you now have available for supplemental educational services, somewhere in the order of.
So, but there will be a deficit.
So you only have $88,000 in terms of monies to provide that service as opposed to $109, Kent. That's right. There's an impact. There's no
There's
question.
an impact. I mean, that's what I want to make sure. There's an impact that students in most of need might not be not getting full impact.
Is that at both Title I schools or just on Darrow?
Title I, and it's largely at New Franklin because it's a what's the term?
No, so I
Yeah,
just wanted to.
it is across the
Alpha
board.
both, okay.
Well, the supplemental educational services kicks in the second year of your CINE status. So New Franklin, having been a little further ahead with CINE status, is in the school.
Right. It's 4 years.
I think it's interesting from the No Child Left Behind perspective that when a school is recognized as in need of improvement, they say that you then need to spend money to work on a plan to improve it. But rather than giving us money to actually do that, they then say, take your money out of Title I and use it for that. It's kind of ironic.
Well, it goes to the discussion we've had, earlier tonight. I still say, child, if you look at it, the student ratio, if I wanted to send my child to get a better student ratio, I'd be sending them to New Franklin because there's a better, by the way, they also have a higher technology ratio over at New Franklin. I mean, just my opinion.
Just saying. One more quick question.
Yes.
Okay. Does Little Harbor need an assistant principal then if their numbers are over 500?
We talked a little bit about that next week. We would be granted we need to support Charlie, and so we're still working that out.
Okay.
But we don't have to hire one. We can get a waiver from the school approval standards.
For this year?
Yes.
What happens next year if it's still over 500?
That'll be another discussion for another time.
Just point of clarification. We were there before with Don Darrow. And we had to work it out to meet the state. And I don't think we had as much of a waiver, but you do have a year basically.
But we are working on ways to support.
Absolutely.
What about the teacher contract that has a certain number of students per class? How are we dealing with that? Because aren't we going above?
Yeah, well, I think placements have just been made, so you're talking about the waiting?
Yeah.
Yeah, the waiting.
Yeah, how are we dealing with that? It could,
As it's raised.
As it's raised, okay. And I have one other question. So I'm looking at this, you're saying that we need 125,248, roughly, right down to the penny.
Well, I mean,
I need it right down to the penny. I don't want one penny
I did say there'd be some variance in that.
I'd round it off if it was me. Okay, so you've got that, but then you say the total you've come up with in your ingenious method of finding money where no one else would find it, you come up with 165,000, roughly. So I don't get it. If all you need
Yeah,
is.
so we got a surplus, right?
Okay, so what I'm thinking though is maybe.
We got a cushion, we got a cushion in the FY12 budget.
Okay, but then maybe we don't need the money from Title I, was what I was just thinking.
Oh, I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Something to look at.
But I think you did a really good job, by the way. P.S.
And just to follow up on your point, this ingenious method of finding that money, there are some sacrifices here.
Oh,
And it's a sort of a gamble, and where everybody's hoping and everyone's thinking that the boiler holds up for another year, no problem.
This year, there's not $66 left over, Steve.
Yes, Rebecca.
At your PowerPoint last week, did you give a breakdown of how many students per grade?
Yes.
Okay. Is that available electronically, or?
I think it's online.
Yeah, I put it online, actually,
Oh,
because it's the same presentation I shared at the Little Harbor evening.
Thank you.
Sure.
So just two quick things. So one is, last week, we got a letter from the mayor. The city council has requested that we sort of follow up and respond back to them. They're interested in hearing what we'd like to do. So I will draft a letter based on the recommendation, and we'll let the city council know what our plan is. And I think we also just might throw in some information that the superintendent had talked last time, just in terms of cost, if we were to consider portables, what they would cost. And the issue of getting a waiver for the assistant principal, because that would have been a cost issue as well. So that's something that we'll follow up on this year, this week. And the other thing is, just to be clear, the issue of the waiver. So I think, even though it sounds like the state might reconsider its policy for next year, so clearly the state had the power to reconsider its policy for this year and chose not to, because had they decided to do that, in this case, it would have helped us. We would have been able to actually deny parents the moving of their kids to Little Harbor, and we wouldn't have had this big an issue. So the state could have made that decision. But I think, we should, as a board, maybe consider writing a letter to the state advocating that they consider changing that policy to make sure that it does get changed, so that next year, because if they don't change it, and there is no Child Left Behind federal waiver, then we're stuck again where we are. So it would be nice to advocate that there's not, as a board, that we try not to allow this to happen again, and we get stuck in an awkward place.
Good idea.
I think it's a great idea, and I mean, just a hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
What are the implications if you choose to ignore this particular?
I would say that the worst case would be federal monies.
And how long would it take for them to cycle through that?
To realize.
Faster than they give it to you.
Probably. I think we should, as a board, write to the New Hampshire Commission. I think it's a great idea.
Well, just also a comment, I would tend to think that through your Superintendent's Association, I mean, we're not the only school that's being impacted. In fact, 50% plus of the schools in New Hampshire might be experiencing the same thing. I mean, so I would tend to think there's a fair amount of pressure.
I'd be curious to know that, actually.
72% of schools in New Hampshire did not make AYP last year.
Right.
There you go.
Right, but I wasn't, that's what you were asking. I thought you were saying how many, that many other districts are dealing with the same situation where parents are moving.
I'm talking about AYP, but choice, invoking choice, yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's the waiver issue. And I guess, if people want to have a little more conversation, moving forward, thinking a little bit forward, I guess the question is, because I know it came up at the last meeting, so how do we want to approach this as a board in the long term? And I would just want to say, because I've been thinking a little about it, that in my mind, the first question I really want to have answered is, what do the demographics continue to look like? Because if we look at the demographics that we got just last December, so not even a year ago, setting aside Little Harbor's new 36 students, and plus there were other students who were coming in from St. Pat's, and whatever other reason, there are more students coming in. Projections really say that within a year or so, elementary level grade students are really going to dip, like 50 or 60 students easily. So, I think as we move forward and think about how do we deal with this in the short term, in the midterm, and the long term, we just need to keep our eyes on what the demographics are suggesting our population is going to be, and that we not overreact, that we try to solve the problem. We look at I'm glad to hear that the administration is, opening up the conversation about Dondero, that we look at it and try to sort of approach it in a rational manner. So I had Kent, your hand was up first.
Yeah, I do believe, and we discussed it last week, that we do need to put a subcommittee of no more than 4, and even 3 to look at, and it isn't just the word redistricting and not just the word demographics, because you want to look at maybe I'll use the word compositions of the school and look at those issues that were brought forth, because it does bother me greatly that test scoring was used maybe to move students for other reasons, and I find that not the right reasons to do it. So the committee can't just look at, and I think you said it there, Mitch, a little bit, is what is the crystal ball have a little bit in store for us in about 5 years. We've had demographics, and nobody ever, I always ask them, will you give us $100 for every dollar or every student that they're off? And they don't seem to want to put that down, because actually we are supposed to be in a dip at this very moment from one of the last studies we had done. We're supposed to actually be dipping fairly fast.
That's true.
A subcommittee to look at elementary, and I'll put it as, needs overall, because if we look at it facility-wise, which we had a good glimpse of it tonight and so forth, what we want. We had a great committee back when the last giant redistricting happened, and we did use the parents, and I would hope that this subcommittee might look at having at least 3 different parent forums in the next 6 months, so that we could have an end to this committee sometime in late March as the budget ends. I wouldn't want to see a committee go on and on. I'd like it to come back and report to the full board and say, yeah, we really do need to do a partial redistricting, and here's the reason why. And again, I'd like to see them working with the parent groups at least 3 different times, if not more, as needed.
Rebecca.
A few months ago, we had a discussion about redistricting, and we, as a board, decided to manage the bubble that was coming up. And I think we definitely need to discuss, but before we jump into redistricting again, if the trend is going down, the problem might just sort of fix itself. So I think before we make any rash decisions.
Right.
And that's what this subcommittee could do.
Because I think somebody raised it earlier as well. I think it was Ann. Just looking back, so this is the little PowerPoint we had back in December from that redistricting workshop we had. And so 10 years ago, it was in fact Dondero with 475 students, and Little Harbor had 378. So it really does fluctuate. Okay. Yes, Dexter.
So I still think it's worthwhile that, I agree with Kent. I think it's worthwhile to put a committee together to look at the distribution of our elementary school population. I wouldn't call it redistricting. That suggests that we're going to take action. What I would call it is that an evaluation of the current allocation of our elementary students, and including what demographics look like, and just reaffirm, in fact, that the decision we made 6 months ago, in fact, is the right one, and you can manage it or not. And the second thing I'd ask, and that, Ed, I know you guys are doing this, but we have a bubble now of those 36 students that will move through. If all things stay the same, we're going to gradually move through Little Harbor. And I think we have the right solution for this year, which is add the 6 pairs. We heard a presentation tonight that in theory you could add some classrooms if you didn't move your special ed, if you didn't move your kindergartens out, and so you could if administration moved out, you could in theory build 4 classrooms that in the future may be kindergarten, but in the interim you could use as classroom space. Right. But I think we need to know now, to the extent the administration can tell us, that we've solved the immediate issue, which is the school year coming up. But over the course of the next 4 school years, or whenever that bubble flows through, what's the proposal to manage it? Is the proposal to continue to add paras and keep them as that bubble migrates through? Because we think that's the right solution and it's temporary. Is the solution no, to build out the classrooms? Because if that is a solution, we should know that now, because that would require then launching design, asking for capital money and all the rest of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a pretty long pole, and we don't want to wait till 2012 or beyond to initiate that. Or is there a third alternative? And I know some of that's hard because we won't have any experience with the paralegals in the classroom. So I'm asking something that is difficult, but I just don't think.
Not paralegals.
Sorry, I mean, sorry, paras. Paras. Paraprofessionals.
Yeah.
But I think we're going to need to, as a board, need to know that answer, unfortunately, sooner rather than later. And I think we can do that, the two things concurrently.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Just to follow up on, because, whether we had school choice or not, this just shows you how vulnerable we are. 10 families could have moved in and had 3 kids going to an elementary school. 10 families moving in is not an unrealistic number. And if each one of them has 3 elementary-age students, that's a 30 student increase in any one of our schools. So I think we need to look at it very wide open, and nothing is off the table until it comes back to the board to say this is what best possible projections can bring.
Tom.
I also just want to bring up the fact that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about are really the mechanics of how do we deal with a situation with influx of kids and what projections are going to be. But also part of that committee, I think we also want to have the ability to just to look at the actual strategy, because clearly we have kids that are moving because of a reason. We also talked about last week that, and I feel strongly that that we are doing a lot of the things that are going to raise Dandaro. We already saw the grades. We've got resources, so we feel like we're the trend line is in the right direction. But in the same token, there might be some things that are expected to climb to an area that we feel is the right area over the course of 2 years, and there might be something that we could do now to remediate or accelerate some of the things that we're trying to do in Dandaro to make that program where it where we expect it to be in a couple of years sooner. And I'm not pointing to anything specific, but just to take a look from a strategy standpoint to say, this is our strategy. We believe it's working, or we believe it will be working. At the moment, we see the positive signs, but can we accelerate it? And is there something that we need to do in the Dandaro school to accelerate it faster? To meet the needs or concerns that have brought these changes this year.
Carol.
We had a work session where we discussed how to manage the bubble that was coming through, and I think we made a good decision that we were not going to manage it through redistricting. The only thing that has changed since then is we have this influx of students from Dandaro because of school choice. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing that's changed. We heard a lot of information tonight about the schools, all of them, and the condition of them. I heard that a lot of the buildings, and particularly Little Harbor, has a lot of problems, mechanical, lack of sprinklers, lack of proper walls, and it just goes on and on. That we heard a lot of issues regarding that building. The building was fairly full before these students came in. Now it's going to be even fuller. I think time is of the essence, and that we really need to look at what we need to do to Little Harbor School as quickly as we possibly can. I know it will not deal with the issue we're facing today, but I think that we've got to deal with that school. We've got to deal with the number of classrooms, the condition of the building, and that would be my hope, is that we go from this presentation and we get an action list and we start moving forward.
Okay, so I would just want to say two quick things. One is, I think I like Tom's idea. That is, as we're looking at, as the administration looks at Dundero, that maybe there are some of the strategies that we're applying across the district that could be accelerated that might be helpful. But I do just sort of want to remind people, that I think the school board has working with the administration, has a pretty potent mixture of instructional strategies that we've put together that that are being implemented as we speak, that have been implemented over the last few years, that Mr. Zadravec sort of laid out for us last week in a very short form. I think so. The implementation of PLCs, the fact that schools and teachers are actually developing SMART goals, and we're measuring and we're taking a look at how we're doing, that there's coaching in math and literacy, two areas specifically that we think are important, that teacher professional development tied to professional learning communities, but also outside of that, and the fact that I think the best thing that I remember hearing when you first brought it up was this whole notion of lesson study, so that you have teachers looking at lesson plans with same grade level teachers, critiquing, sharing ideas and thoughts and trying to tweak it and make it better, and everybody agrees that at the end that these are great lesson plans and that's going to really spur student growth and learning on, and also grade level collaboration. So I just want the community to realize that there is really a great instructional strategy in many instructional strategies in place in all of the elementary schools as well as the middle and the high school, and we will look and see where things are not working as well as they are in others, and we'll address them. So the issue with the committee. So maybe what we'll do is send out an email to people to see who's interested in serving, and then try to at the same time come up with a rough charge of what that committee might do. And I'm going to work a little bit off of Dexter's suggestion and come up with a good name for that group. So, okay.
What's to happen?
Okay. All right. Moving on. New business. Updates on new hires.
So since the board last met, the superintendent has hired 3 new employees, so we'll bring those names to you this evening. We've hired Rebecca Rader as a half-time nurse at Portsmouth High School. Rebecca has her bachelor's in nursing from Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and most recently was a substitute nurse for us here in Portsmouth, as well as a registered nurse at Lehigh Valley Hospital in Cedar Crest and Allentown, Pennsylvania. We have Lisa Sweet coming in as a 6th grade math and science teacher, replacing Travis Park, who has resigned, as you know, this evening. Lisa is a master's degree in teaching and curriculum from Harvard University in Cambridge, a bachelor's in biomedical engineering from Duke University, and most recently was a 1-year fill-in for a similar position at Portsmouth Middle School, teaching math and science at the 6th grade. And we have Christopher Rose for a 1-year position as a science teacher at Portsmouth Middle School, filling in for Danielle Herman's leave of absence. Christopher has his bachelor's in business administration from the University of Vermont, and most recently was a substitute teacher and paraprofessional for us at the middle school as well.
Okay.
Move to approve.
Second.
So moved.
Anyone have any discussions on any of the candidates? We'll take them as a packet, since there's only 3. So all in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Very good. Where are we? Okay, first readings. So Kathleen Dwyer, thank you for coming back. How was dinner?
Haven't had it yet. Though I think you considered the policy committee minutes from earlier, and these are the policies that the committee has recommended for first reading. The first being service animals, which is a newly required policy by state statute, which provides for the use of service animals, mainly dogs, in the schools for those individuals who need them. Any questions? I'd be glad to answer them.
Rebecca.
I have a question. It says in accordance with 28 CFR. Is that a state regulation?
That's a federal regulation.
That's a federal regulation. Okay. So, reading it says only dogs are considered service animals.
By state definition.
By
yes.
state definition. I'm assuming if we had a student that had another animal as a service animal, we would allow that?
There is a provision in the statute that you could consider other animals.
And then at the bottom of the service animal definition, it talks about providing emotional support, well-being, and comfort. Then the provision that you have over if a student has an IEP, because sometimes they need the emotional.
Correct.
So we would allow them to bring their animal to school.
And you're referring to a separate federal regulatory scheme for the delivery of services for students with special needs, and that would also apply. So whatever the team would determine the student needed would be permissible.
And if a student had another animal besides a dog, we would allow that?
No, I wouldn't say a blanket yes, but more than likely yes. It would be very unusual for it to be something other than a dog, but
I mean,
there
I know some people have monkeys for mobility. They, have horses as seeing eye animals. They live a lot longer and don't have to be trained as often.
In those, when we have students with those severe type of needs, we normally provide them with a paraprofessional.
It happens. I mean, I just want to make sure we're not creating a policy where a student who has an animal other than a dog is not.
Normally, the animal we would provide would be a human.
I mean, did you actually
are
say
they allowed
monkey?
yes, in this policy?
Only if they're housebroken.
Only if they're housebroken. You read that.
No minkies.
Okay, so that's a new required one.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
So do you want to do them all at the
Do you want to
end?
take them one at a time? Okay.
Or we
Motion
could-
to approve. First reading.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
The second policy the committee's recommended for first reading is behavior management and intervention, which is again a required policy under the New Hampshire Administrative Code dealing with education, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It just requires different techniques to be used to meet students' needs when their behavior needs to be managed for one reason or another. And again, Rebecca's point, you can see this throughout some of these required policies, that if an individual student's IEP required a particular behavior technique, that would be employed for that student.
Okay. Motion to accept. First
Some-
reading.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
The third policy is the school guidance and counseling program, which, again, under the New Hampshire administrative rules dealing with education, it requires that every school have a guidance, counseling, and counseling program plan, which the district, it's an evolving type plan, which is always under review, and this is requiring that plan. So it's not that you didn't have a plan, you just didn't have the required policy.
Yes, Clay.
I'll make a motion that we accept this policy for first reading.
First reading.
Second.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
The next policy is the health education and exemption from instruction, which allows an opt-out for parents who do not want their students to participate in various parts of the health curriculum. It requires instruction, including instruction about parts of the body, reproduction, and related topics, and it provides a vehicle by which the parent could come in and look at the materials that were going to be used, and if they had some objection, could, through the principal, opt their student out of that particular piece of the instruction. And this is a required policy.
Okay. Clay.
I'll make a motion, Mr. Chairman, that we accept this policy for first reading.
So moved.
Seconded, okay. Any other discussion on that? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
Next policy is, again, a required policy dealing with community resources, which endorses a number of community participation with the schools and partnering in various school department endeavors. Again, it's required.
All things that we're doing currently, and more.
Yes.
Right.
Motion to approve.
So move. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
The next would be a revision to a currently existing policy on harassment and sexual harassment. Our policy previously was just named harassment. We've included, the committee's recommended that it be renamed harassment and sexual harassment, which is a particular legal form of, legally identified form of harassment. This had been sent to Primex, your insurer, for comment when they were getting ready to come in and do training for staff on the policy, and they made a couple of suggestions, some minor word changes that we wrote into the policy, and the major thrust of which was to more clearly identify those that conduct which would be considered harassment and sexual harassment that you see on the first page there. Most of the rest of the policy stays the same, and it's also been rewritten to apply to all people. And we used to have two policies, one that dealt with students and one that dealt with staff, and now it would just be under one policy, but contained in two sections of the book.
Yes, Kent.
Question. I guess part of my wonderment is, as we just keep having policies, and whether they're dictated by either the feds, the state, or ourselves, is under this one, Kathleen, is that I have no problem with the sexual harassment part of this. I think, you know, we've migrated and gotten much more clear on what that is from way back when I began. The overlapping issue is under harassment, under the new bullying policy that we have. We're repeating ourselves. I mean, I did take a quick look, and, you know, threats of physical violence to harm to a person and property, you know, any of that, anything that falls under the harassment falls under the bullying part. Is that not a fairly correct assumption, that you really, one could feel bullied? I mean, there may be some gray area there, but I almost feel I want the sexual harassment one to stand out by itself, which I believe, did it not at one time? There was one where we just said sexual harassment.
Many years ago, that's
okay.
true. And that's why we've kind of added that back into the title now.
Okay.
Because it had been removed for a number of years.
And I don't want that diluted in any manner. I mean, I almost feel one or two ways here. One is sexual harassment should be a policy that stands amongst itself, because it both covers both on the student side and that on the employment side. And then harassment either needs to, in my opinion, might need to stand alone, because again, it takes away, I think, a portion, or it needs to be part of the bullying policy. And maybe you can guide me differently.
Well, the bullying policy that the state considered was targeted student behaviors towards fellow students, where harassment and sexual harassment transcends that. It also, it's a workplace issue.
Can you say that again about bullying, that was just student? I want to make sure I understand that.
It was targeted to address student behavior versus those behaviors which also can occur in the workplace. In the workplace, certain conduct, if it happened between students, would be considered bullying, as you just identified. Only legally, we call that harassment or sexual harassment when it involves adults. That's kind of like the shorthand.
I guess you didn't open the question. Is that I always thought when we said the bullying policy, and I remember we had the discussion, that if we felt whether a teacher or a coach in circumstances, you know, a student felt bullied on that would also be covered under that bullying policy. No, it would be covered under this?
Among many other things.
Yeah.
It can involve staff.
I hope so.
But yes, it would involve this.
Okay.
And
we're doubling it up to some degree, correct?
It would what?
We're doubling it up with some of this verbiage.
A lot of policies overlap, and for instance, a number of years ago, we used to, when we would get complaints that were sexual harassment or harassment in nature, we'd turn them over to the police because often it's criminal conduct. Sometimes it's not. And we used to wait till the criminal investigation was done until OCR said to us, no, you need to do a parallel track and do your own investigation, and you can't wait. So there are a number of overlaps, not just with our own policies, but with state statutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so motion to accept first reading?
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussions? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
The next policy is in regard to changing student grades, which I think is included in the minutes. The policy committee undertook this after several issues have arisen over the years about parents wanting a teacher to change a grade and either doing it directly with the teacher or sometime circumventing that process and going directly to a principal or even to the superintendent, which then led us to take a look at, the gap in our own policy. So after much discussion, this policy was generated for first reading, which basically says that all grades are going to be final unless there's evidence of mistake, incompetence, or fraud, and that the only request based upon that criteria would be to a final grade or a final exam, not individual test grades along the way. They'd be final.
Question towards the superintendent?
Oh, yes, sir.
Sort of with this, though, is that where do we stand in that the grade weighting in the high school levels that we have talked about, that, career tech, college prep, and so forth. I mean, I know we've discussed this. In fact, I know I had a great discussion with a couple of students just about 2 weeks ago on this in regards to, there are disadvantages on this, that they would be taking other classes and so forth. And I think sometimes people feel, we want to change the grade because it goes to their student standing within ranking, I guess. So,
right.
I mean, where do we stand on that as we discuss?
Well, this policy is
this is changing.
You're talking about whether you weight courses a certain level.
Right. And I think sometimes we get into the discussion, well, this one's an easier class or something, and I've heard parents be very discouraged that way because of the weight of the class.
But this policy would address the issue of I'm a teacher in the English classroom and I've issued a final grade of a B+. The family may come in, the student may come in, whomever, and say, I really deserve an A, A-. Who dictates that? They go to the principal and say, I want the grade changed if the teacher doesn't give them any recourse. What this policy says is a teacher's grade is final. Mm-hmm. What the decision they've made is final, absent mistake, incompetence, or fraud. Now, your issue is, I think, something much larger, which is about high school and how we weight grades, and
right.
Perhaps we could...
Absolutely, but...
Yeah. It's unrelated to this policy, is all I'm trying to say, I think.
I'll move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
And I think getting to the last one, the policy committee's been busy the last couple months, is the required data and record retention, which requires you to have a policy about what records you keep and how long you're going to keep them for, and we attach to the policy what the state has as particular records. So some, as you can see, are required to be part of a permanent record, some you have to keep for a year. And we also have additional, sometimes we exceed this and keep records for longer, but this would be what you would be required to do.
Okay.
Just a point of curiosity, are these predominantly electronic, or are these predominantly paper?
They get fiche, microfiche.
Are these fiched?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that sort of the ongoing standard?
That's the standard practice, isn't it, Steve, for most records?
Yes.
Okay.
Although that is a dying technology, we know that, right?
Yeah.
So I think we keep special ed records.
And CDs are...
Yeah, okay. So motion to accept this last first reading?
So moved. Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Kathleen.
for coming back
Kathleen,
out.
thank you.
So two other little quick things here. One is consideration of approval, so you can walk us through this.
Yes, Mr. Bartlett, if you don't mind.
From time to time, there's a requirement that agreements between the school department and the local government center need to be signed. And one of the requirements that they have is that there is a board resolution saying that I am allowed to sign these things that I've been signing since the last resolution for you on your behalf. So it's just a formality that they require, that there's a board vote to allow me to sign these agreements as they come up.
So moved.
Yes, Rebecca.
So is this LGC the same LGC? So should we be voting on this? I mean, I think, aren't they're under investigation? I mean, I have no problem with Steve signing things on our behalf, but this is
That's all this resolution is, whether, I mean, if you don't do this resolution, I can't sign the forms, and you will be affecting employee benefits such as health insurance and things like that in a negative way, which is not a good thing to do, in my opinion. That the issue between LGC and the Insurance Commission, if you read everything that's there, I don't think it's as bad as the headlines make it sound, quite frankly. But that's my take on having read all that stuff and being close to it. It's kind of unrelated to this resolution.
I think we can. I think they're separate issues completely.
No, I just didn't know if continuing forward with this particular group.
Until there's something.
Right. And we don't have anything else in place.
Nothing in place.
That doesn't mean that's right, but.
Right. No, I mean, the LGC situation will get worked out with the regulations, but at the moment, this is our main health insurance provider of choice, and I need to be able to sign the renewals, so that's all.
So they're basically not asking us for a vote of confidence, just for
Right.
for him to sign.
Yeah. It's more a vote of confidence that I can sign my name after I wrote stuff.
Correct. So a motion to accept that, to allow Stephen to sign for us. Any further discussion? So all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
Go off and sign.
So the last thing on here has to do with a question of the school board library trustee liaison. So this came up, and I'll ask Carol to talk a little bit about it, but this came up in a conversation with Carol, who is currently the school board representative to the library board of trustees. Before Carol, Ann has done it once, if not more than once. I did it for a year myself. And the question has come up that I guess the question is, does there need to continue to be a school board presence on that library board of trustees? So Carol, maybe you could talk a little bit about where this is coming from.
I just, since I've been on the library board of trustees, since I've been on the school board, there just hasn't been very many issues that have come up where I felt like it was really important for me to be there, to be a liaison. There was a couple of things that came up that I talked to Mary Ann, the director, about, and she was already in touch with Ed about those issues. And I believe that Ed and Mary Ann, you can correct me, Ed, but I believe that you meet on a somewhat regular basis to discuss issues. So between Ed and Mary Ann already meeting and discussing the issues, I wonder when I'm on the board if there really is a purpose for someone from the school board to be on that board. I'm certainly willing to be on it if, the feeling is that that's important and there's a value to it. I'll certainly do it, but it hasn't appeared that way to me so far. And in my conversations with Mary Ann, I don't think she feels it's necessary. And I know that they have a list of people who are very interested in serving on the Library Board of Trustees who have a real passion for libraries. And I think they might be better served by having somebody like that on their board. And we even talked about the concept of having maybe my being on the board, but being some sort of, I don't know what the word is, ex officio, or some kind of member where I don't vote, and that way they could have somebody else on who votes, so they could get one more of these people on that they're interested in having on. So that was just another idea, and that's basically it. I'm perfectly happy to serve on it. I just, so far, to me, it hasn't appeared efficient, and it doesn't seem efficient with regard to the superintendent and the director meeting and talking about school issues.
Ann.
I felt as though the 2 years, or maybe it was 3, that I served, there were many occasions where discussions came up. And so I think it's a valuable kind of thing. That may not be the case now, but I think possibly the solution might be to do the ex officio, because they definitely do need to have a quorum, and they need to have people be there, so that if people are absent, that's a real problem. And I know there were some people that were missing on some occasions, and we were scraping up a quorum. So I think that might be a good solution.
Yes.
I concur with Ann. I mean, there's a history to it, and there are times, I'm sure, that it's dry and it's non-related to schools to a large degree. But as the library has expanded and we collaborate with the libraries more and more, with the middle school being there, and issues that could arise with parking or anything. But I do believe parking could become that we need a communication tool. We have two. We used to have, and I'd also look at it that these were governed pseudo under city charter at one point. That it was city charter that the school department would have representation on the rec board, the library trustees, and they used but even no, that's not charter. But there was another one that board no longer even exists. I actually was part of the conservation board, I believe, at one point. So again, it's more of a communication tool, and it does have the library probably has one of the lengthier histories of owning it to it. And God bless Ray Bowles. I mean, he didn't want to be on anything else but the library committee. And somewhere down the road, I think we need to actually even bring that type of discussion into it, is that, what do we do to recognize? But I understand where you're coming from, Carol, that at this point, there are times I go to the rec board way back until before Rusty became part of us, which was a big cost savings. And who knows what, higher thoughts may be down the road is that how can we better collaborate both financially and so forth. So I tend to say at this point I'd like to see it stay as is, and if it does need to go to a liaison type position, we can bring it back.
Right. I would tend to agree with, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say I tend to agree. I tend to think that down the road I see technology integration. I see our library starting to meld together opportunities for kids to participate and study at the library. I see down the road closer collaboration. At this time, I agree with Ken.
And they've been wonderful partners with us as well. They've embraced the middle school kids. I mean, so many people in the community say, "Oh my goodness, they must hate to see them coming." I said, "No, they love them. They're great. They're very welcoming," and I'm grateful to them for that.
I think it makes sense to not have the school board member being a voting member of the library board. I think having an ex officio, but if the superintendent is in touch with the director of the library, we're certainly going to get that communication. I think being able to have a quorum is very important. And is there a city councilor who sits on the library board of trustees as a voting member?
I don't think so.
Yeah, then it seems like this might have been a holdover from something else. I think, the communication is there, it's important, but I don't think having a voting member, I think that might hinder them. And if it's something that Marianne is comfortable with, then, we should take her idea, her suggestion and.
I mean, presumably, they've checked out whatever city charters or bylaws or anything. I mean, I don't think we're necessarily in a position of unilaterally making the decision,
No, I
are
think
we?
we would have to go through the city
she would.
legal department.
Yeah, so.
There are a few steps. It's not something
And
that we
it-
have, I just wanted to get it out there and
And it
discuss
sounds
it.
like, based on your description, that one of the drivers is that they'd love to get rid of you so they can get someone else.
That's no reason.
I'm not sure that's a great driver, and maybe they should
Yeah.
add to the number of
I would.
of trustees that they have to
Yeah.
get the quorum issue
To
and
get
all the
their
rest of
quorum
that
issue,
stuff.
yep.
But I think fundamentally, having a relationship with the library and the school board is a good thing.
I agree.
And I don't think we give it up easily. We may restructure it. So it's an ex officio
Yeah.
rather than voting member, although I'm not sure if that really changes anything.
It doesn't
But,
make a quorum any good.
yeah, and
Well, it changes things on their end.
but there may be other ways to get at it, is my point. If they really are dying to add
Why are we the vehicle?
staff, there are different vehicles, and not just take the position that we have and-
Away.
and use that because they have some other people who want to serve.
Yeah, I agree.
You can change your board's, your trustee structure.
Yep.
Had to.
But it would
Exactly.
free up board members from not being on yet one more committee.
Well, that's a different question altogether. So,
We do have a lot.
in January, we do
Yeah.
reconfigure committees. So I would just say, and I agree with Kent on this, actually. I think in the short term, while the construction's going on and working out the closer relationships, I think it's great to have a school board member there. And I absolutely think at least for the moment, we shouldn't give up our voting rights. Maybe reevaluate that a little further down once the school's done and see how things are going. But I think, you never know. There's an issue that could come up that it would be important for us to have a voice, and it might actually be different than the voice of other people on the Board of Trustees. You
So
never
the
know.
consensus is to stay on and not change to some
now.
other type of member at the moment? Okay, for now.
Yeah,
All
I
right,
think that's
sounds good.
Okay. So moving on to committee reports.
Arts and athletics.
Arts and athletics.
It's been a couple of months since we had our last meeting, so Dexter, help me out if I'm missing something.
You're on your own.
We meet only a couple times a year, so we meet the end of the sort of winter season, the end of the spring season, and then maybe once in the middle. So we met in July?
Yes.
We met in July.
Yeah, that I remember.
Beginning of July. And a couple things came out of the meeting. One is an updated athletic handbook. The arts group is working on a handbook that's similar to the athletic handbook. We reviewed the new discipline policy, and everybody feels like that's working really well. We reviewed all of the participation in the spring sports and arts programs, very strong, lots of really good, our baseball team, and we've talked about this a little bit. Our baseball team, obviously, everybody knows, did phenomenally. Girls lacrosse, so we talked a little bit about that. The one thing that was really kind of cool is we came up with, or actually Ed and Russ came up with a compact that will be handed out to students and parents at the beginning of each athletic season that talks about everybody's role. So it talks about parents' role, it talks about athletes' role, and it talks about coaches' roles. So it does some definition for people, and I think kind of spells out what the expectations are. So that was really well done, and that will be handed out to students as well as parents at each parent, at the beginning of the sport for parents, because I think every coach meets with has a parent meeting at the beginning of the sport. So I think that will be really nice, and it was very well done. Am I missing anything?
Yeah, and the last thing we did is Russ presented a revised performance evaluation process.
Yes, thank you, yes. Which is also well done.
Is consistent with the other evaluations that we're doing with other staff positions.
Yes.
And that will be implemented beginning in the fall season.
Thank you, yes. So, good, great movement.
Yeah.
Questions? Thank you. JVC.
So quickly, the Parrott Ave Middle School project is on schedule. If you've passed by there, yesterday you saw some steel going up. So steel is, the foundation work is done, steel is going up. A lot of exciting stuff is happening there. We've scheduled an information center, an information meeting tomorrow night here at City Hall at 7 o'clock. And the intent is to go through the status of the project, specific issues related to the construction management process, and sort of where we are and what our schedule looks like for the next 6 months. The other thing I'd report out is on the Granite Street field, or the Granite, what is it called? Alumni Wentworth Field, officially named Alumni Wentworth Field. The field itself is complete, and if you go by there, the lights are up, the grass is green, it's looking terrific, and the only thing that needs to be done is the completion of the concession stand, and that is delayed, so we're off schedule. And the fundamental reason we're off schedule is we bid out some of the steel related to that with the steel fabrication on Parrott Ave to save a little money. And so now that the steel is getting delivered to Parrott Ave, it's going to begin to get delivered to finish that piece. We'll have I don't have a projected completion date on that. We should have that tomorrow night. And at that time, then we'll have a date when we'll be turning that field over to the city, to the Recreation Department, because it's a rec field at that point, for them to administer. We missed our schedule. It's unfortunate, a whole host of reasons, primarily weather. But
Well, the state didn't help either.
yeah, exactly. The state dragged their feet on a few things. So come tomorrow night, or turn on Channel 22.
It'll be live?
It is going to be live telecast. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Any questions? Seeing as we had policy, I don't think we need to cover that. Yes.
Not much going on there.
Prior to adjournment, I do have a request, and, I understand the city council's concern in wanting to be updated, and I hope they watch the Channel 22 and they read the papers and so forth, and they get the same information. But we do work independently as elected officials. There's been a issue in the back of my mind of something that I'm going to turn the tides. I'm going to request formally an update on the water sewer, because we're the fourth largest water sewer user in the city, going out through the Pierce Island, which is not meeting compliance. And I want to know our impact of this water sewer discharge out through the Pierce Island facility. Reason being, and a little tongue-in-cheek, I am turning the tide a little bit on a request, is that as the issue of fines and so forth come forth, I want to make sure that the school department, being a city facility, is not held liable at any time for any issue due to the incompliance of the sewage discharge out of Pierce Island. Like I said, we're the fourth largest user of that facility. So I do formally request that we be updated on what our impact, number one, what our impact is on it. Number two, is there any liability from the school department? Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
One last thing.
Talia?
Our next policy meeting is September 14th, which is a Wednesday, at 9 o'clock.
So our next school board meeting, I don't have it written down. The 13th. Okay. So I just want to say, since we won't be seeing you before then, we want to wish you good luck in the beginning of the school year. And with that, motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
So what date are we meeting?